He was searching for his cows in the Nevada desert, but he found an abandoned phone booth that shouldn't have been working. When he picked up the receiver, a man who had long been presumed dead spoke to him. This was only the first sign that his past had not let him go. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The heat had a way of settling into an old man's bones, slipping through denim and worn leather, as if age itself were made of sunlight and dust. For 72-year-old Maddock Crane, the Nevada desert had long ago become both a home and a reminder that nothing in life stayed still, not even land that looked dead on the surface. 3 days he'd been out here, walking the ridges and arroyos of the high desert, calling for the 3 cows that had wandered off after the last thunderstorm. They were good cows, strong, smart enough to find shade, but foolish enough to chase greener patches of grass on the wrong side of the fence. Maddock had once joked that they had more sense than most people he knew, but now, trudging across sandstone broken by decades of erosion, he felt each step like it pressed deeper into time rather than dirt. He kept telling himself the same thing. Find the cows, bring them home, fix the broken railing on the north pasture, and that would be enough for the week. But the desert had its own ways of reminding him that plans were the flimsiest things a man could hold on to. His throat felt scraped raw, his canteen empty since noon, and the wind carried a metallic taste that he hadn't noticed in years, something that stirred memories he'd buried so deep he sometimes believed they weren't his at all. By late afternoon, the sky had softened into a copper bruise, clouds smudged thin by the drifting heat. Maddock paused on a ridge, leaning forward with his hands on his knees, breathing slow to ease the tightness in his chest. His old heart thumped steadily, a stubborn metronome refusing to falter, even when the land stretched so far he couldn't tell where horizon ended and the first stars might begin. He wiped sweat from his brow and scanned the plain below. No cows, no fresh tracks, nothing but creosote bushes shaking with the restless wind and the faint suggestion of a road long swallowed by sand and time. 3 days was too long to be out here without proper rest, and yet turning back felt like admitting a kind of defeat he didn't allow himself. He had lived most of his life refusing to turn back. Sometimes that had served him well. Other times, well, the past had its shadows. He started down the rocky slope, his boots scraping against crumbling shale. His joints protested, knees stiff from years of ranch work and a few injuries he never quite bothered to have fully seen to. As he descended, something tugged at the back of his mind, a memory he didn't want, but couldn't stop from rising. He thought of Remy Boyle, the way the man laughed like every sentence had 2 meanings. Remy had been the only person Maddock trusted during those strange, quiet months in 1973, when they'd signed papers with more blacked-out lines than visible ones and carried out tasks no young men should have agreed to. Maddock had told himself those memories didn't matter anymore. The desert, though, had a way of unearthing things, the same way it loosened stones from hillsides and exposed bones that were never meant to be found. At the base of the slope, something glinted faintly in the fading light. Not the cows. Not an animal's eyes. Something straight, hard-edged, almost geometric. Out of place among the rocks. Maddock narrowed his gaze. There, beside the buried outline of the old maintenance road, stood a structure he hadn't seen in decades. A phone booth. An honest-to-God Nevada bell booth. Its glass cracked, its frame warped but still upright like some forgotten monument to a different America. He stared at it with a mixture of disbelief and wariness, because out here, miles from any settlement, such a thing had no right to exist unless someone had put it there intentionally. He'd seen booths like that in his youth, back when you could drop a dime and call the nearest town to ask about weather or mail, but they hadn't operated out here since the 90s. Most had been dismantled, their metal sold for scrap. And yet this one stood as if waiting for what he couldn't imagine. Curiosity and exhaustion pulled him closer. The booth's door hung slightly ajar, glass panels dusted with sand, except for a single streak, a clean line that suggested someone had touched it recently. That unsettled him more than the booth itself. He pushed the door open with his fingertips. It creaked softly, the sound swallowed by the dry wind. Inside, the air was stale, holding the scent of rust and something faintly oily like old machinery, struggling to remember how it once functioned. Maddock looked at the receiver. The plastic was faded, but intact. He lifted it, expecting nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Silence. Then a faint, almost imperceptible clicking, like metal settling inside a sealed room. He pressed one of the buttons on the keypad. Nothing. Another button. Still nothing. His heart thudded as irritation mingled with unease. He started to lower the receiver, but as his finger slipped off the keypad, a tone pulsed through the line. Soft, distant, not the clean electronic beep of a working phone, but something muffled, as though traveling through a labyrinth of old cables and forgotten relays. Maddock jerked the receiver back up to his ear. The tone faded. Tension crawled along his spine, a sense memory awakening from years of dormancy. Back in '73, sometimes he'd heard tones like that, faint and irregular, from machines that were never supposed to transmit anything to the outside world. The wind gusted. Something inside the booth clinked. Maddock looked down and saw a small metallic object lying in the corner. He crouched stiffly and picked it up. A key. Small, brass, cool to the touch despite the heat. A worn leather strap clung to its loop, cracked and fragile. On the head of the key was stamped BC. 27. His breath stuck in his throat. BC could have meant many things, but to him, it meant only one. Black Coyote, the code name they'd worked under. Something he hadn't spoken aloud since the day he'd left that desert facility with orders drilled so deep into him, he'd nearly convinced himself they'd never existed. He swallowed hard and examined the booth more closely. On the right panel, beneath layers of dust, someone had scraped a thin arrow. Not drawn with a tool, but scratched with something sharp. Perhaps a knife, or the edge of a metal shard. The arrow pointed downward, toward the booth's concrete base. A heavy sensation pressed against Maddock's ribs. He bent down, brushing sand aside until he found a broken section of concrete. Beneath it lay a small cavity carved out years ago, hidden unless someone knew precisely where to look. Inside sat a metal box, rust eating into its corners, but the latch still intact. The key in his hand fit the lock perfectly. Before he could turn it, the phone behind him rang. A sound impossible enough that his legs nearly buckled. A wild, shrill cry that pierced the dead air. He turned slowly, the world narrowing to the trembling booth. He picked up the receiver with a hand that no longer felt like his own. At first, there was only static. Then a breath. Then a voice, raspy, trembling, barely more than a whisper. Maddock Crane. The voice paused, as though the speaker had to catch breath from some distant, hollow place. If you're hearing this, it means they found the trail again. Go to Shaft 9. Don't lose time. The line went dead. Maddock stood completely still, the receiver pressed to his ear long after silence returned. Every part of him rejected what he'd heard. Remy Boyle had vanished in 1973, declared missing, presumed dead. Others, too. People tied to Black Coyote had disappeared one by one. Maddock had spent a lifetime convincing himself Remy couldn't possibly still be alive. He let the receiver slip back into place. His breath came shallow, uneven, as though he'd awakened into someone else's story. But the key in his hand was real. The arrow etched into the booth was real. and the box, hidden in the concrete, was real. He unlocked it with a quiet click. Inside he found a folded map, edges browned by time. Beneath it lay sheets of paper, listing names he recognized all too well, workers from the facility. Technicians, field agents, people officially marked as casualties of an industrial collapse. He saw Remy's name. He saw others whose fates had been swallowed by lies. A photograph lay underneath the documents, a picture of him and Remy standing in the desert before a chain-link fence. Maddock was young, his smile full of a confidence he no longer remembered having. Remy had an arm slung over his shoulder, both men unaware of the storm their futures would become. At the bottom of the box was a diagram hand-drawn, precise. It showed an access route to a place labeled only as Shaft 9, a location Maddock had avoided for half a century, a place where things had happened that he'd tried to forget. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the plain, and in that fading light, Maddock felt a truth he hadn't allowed himself to face. The past hadn't died. It had waited, patiently, quietly, like the desert itself. He closed the box and held it against his chest. The cows, his original reason for coming out here, felt suddenly unimportant in comparison. Something was happening, something that tied the man he once was to the man he had become. And despite the fear rising inside him, a deeper instinct pushed him forward. He turned from the booth, feeling the weight of the desert on his shoulders. The map showed the direction to Shaft 9. The phone call urged him toward it, and the darkest memories of his life warned him of what he might find there. Still, he started walking toward the dying sun, the box tucked under his arm, the wind whispering secrets across the empty land as the long-buried machinery of his past began to awaken. The desert changed its character after sundown, shedding its shimmering veil of heat and wrapping itself in a harsher stillness. Maddock had walked through Nevada nights most of his life, but tonight the darkness felt different, as though it were composed of layers, some belonging to the land he knew, and some belonging to a past version of himself he'd hoped had died long ago. The box he carried pressed against his ribs with every step, a small weight that somehow felt heavier than any saddlebag he'd hauled in his ranching days. Maps, names, a photograph that shouldn't have survived this long. Every piece inside that box carried its own burden, and together they formed a weight that pulled him steadily toward Shaft 9. He followed the landscape as best he remembered, letting instinct take over where the map grew vague. The old service roads were nearly erased by erosion, carved into faint scars across hills that had shifted with flash floods and decades of neglect. He didn't use his flashlight. The moon offered enough pale light to guide him, and using the flashlight might draw attention from whoever else might be out here. The thought nagged at him, the idea that he was not alone, that those unseen men from nearly 50 years ago, or men like them, still watched these desert spaces carefully. He tried not to let paranoia take root, but he'd lived long enough to know that fear was sometimes only another word for memory. He paused to catch his breath near a cluster of boulders where desert varnish shined like polished obsidian. Sweat cooled on his neck despite the lingering warmth in the rocks, and for a moment, he closed his eyes. He could almost hear Remy's voice, laughing at something crude, or urging him to move faster through a night like this. They had been young, reckless, convinced they were working for something bigger than themselves. Maddock's youth had been defined by a loyalty that now made older him feel hollow. The government had used them all, then discarded them when the truth threatened to seep through the cracks. The Black Coyote Project was supposed to remain buried literally and figuratively. And yet here he was, walking right back into its jaws. The shape of Shaft 9 emerged slowly from the dark as he approached the ridge that overlooked the canyon. Even from a distance, he recognized the geometry of abandonment, the skeletal remnants of machinery, the slumped support beams, and the entrance partially collapsed by a mine cave-in from decades past. A chain-link fence sagged against bent poles. The old restricted area signs faded to illegible smears. He gripped the box tighter. Whoever had been here recently had managed to get inside despite the rubble. He spotted it now, the faint impression of boot tracks cutting through the sand, leading toward the opening. He made his way down through the rubble, stepping carefully over broken timbers and rusted metal shards. A faint wind stirred up stale dust that clung to his lips and throat. Once he reached the entrance, he stood still for a moment, gathering what strength he had left. A younger man might have said a prayer. Maddock only breathed deeply and muttered to himself that if Remy Boyle had somehow orchestrated this, then the least Maddock could do was see it through. Inside the mine, the faint moonlight vanished quickly. Maddock flicked on his flashlight, keeping the beam pointed low. The main tunnel sloped downward at a steady angle, reinforced by wooden beams that groaned under the weight of time. The air grew cooler as he descended, carrying the mineral scent of earth that had not seen sunlight since long before he'd been born. His footsteps echoed in a careful rhythm. Each sound reminded him that silence was not safety in a place like this. Silence merely meant that whatever was here did not want to be found yet. Eventually, he reached a section where the tunnel widened, and the marks of recent disturbance became clearer. Someone had moved rocks aside, scraping the walls in the process. The flashlight beam caught on scuff marks, footprints, and the faint reflection of metal dust. Maddock's heartbeat drummed in his ears as he moved forward. He was not the first to return. Whoever had come before him had likely gone deeper, toward the facility that had been sealed when the mine was deemed unstable. The tunnel opened into a small chamber where a rusted metal door leaned off its hinges. A sign above it, although half-rotted, still read, "Emergency Relay Room." Maddock swallowed hard. He remembered this room, not the exact shape of it, or the exact smell of it, but he remembered standing somewhere like this while Remy talked about frequencies and signals and systems that weren't supposed to exist. He remembered the feeling of unease that had crawled up his spine the day they'd been told never to return here. He stepped inside. Wires hung from conduits overhead. Some snapped, some fused by time or heat. The air felt unnaturally cold, as though some forgotten ventilation system still exhaled through rusted vents. In the corner stood an old relay cabinet, tall as a man, the metal scorched in places. Maddock's flashlight revealed the flicker of a tiny indicator light, the barest glow, but unmistakably alive. It shouldn't have been possible. Nothing here should have worked after decades without maintenance or power. Yet as Maddock stepped closer, he heard it, the faint pulsing tone that had come through the phone booth, a sound too familiar to ignore. His throat tightened. Part of him wanted to smash the machine with the nearest tool, to end whatever was still breathing here. Part of him knew he had to listen. He moved the beam of his flashlight across the table beside the relay unit. Stacks of papers lay there, yellowed and curling. Dates from the early 70s were scribbled on their edges. He sifted through them, shaking fingers tracing names. Technicians, field personnel, miners. Some names crossed out with heavy ink strokes. Some annotated with words like relocated, in compliance, or worse, non-compliant. He remembered the euphemisms. Non-compliant never meant anything good. At the bottom of the stack were documents printed with diagrams of containment suits, airflow systems, and evacuation protocols. Black Coyote had never been about safety. Not really. They'd all been told it was. But the truth had been something darker. Something that made young Maddock feel both brave and expendable. Now, in his old age, he understood that the bravest men were often the most misled. A new sound trickled through the air. He froze. It wasn't machinery. It was softer, Irregular, a shifting of gravel under boot soles. Someone was in the tunnel behind him. He killed the flashlight instantly and pressed himself against the cool wall, listening with every fiber of his being. Two voices, muffled but clear enough to recognize as human, drifted closer. Men, not locals. Their footsteps were too sure, their cadence practiced. One voice hissed something about checking the second relay, while the other muttered Maddox's last name as though it tasted sour in his mouth. They were hunting him. He clenched the box tighter and moved silently toward a side corridor where the shadows were deepest. The tunnel sloped upward slightly, and he followed it until he reached a narrow shaft that had collapsed years ago. With nowhere else to go, he tucked himself behind a fallen beam and stayed absolutely still. The men entered the relay room moments later. Their flashlights carved bright arcs across the walls. One of them approached the relay machine, tapping it with a gloved hand and cursing. "He'll come," the other said. "Old fool can't leave this buried any more than the others." Maddox felt the chill of realization sink into his bones. They knew he was coming. They had been waiting. And if they were here, then there must be more others watching the land, tracking movements, keeping Black Coyote buried by force if necessary. The men lingered only a few minutes before heading deeper into the mine. Maddox waited until their voices faded to ghosts before emerging from his hiding place. His whole body trembled with the effort of staying silent. He knew he couldn't linger. He also knew he couldn't turn back. Something waited for him, not just here, but beyond the mine, beyond the desert. Something Remy had wanted him to find. He retraced his steps carefully, avoiding the gravel patches that could give him away. When he finally reached the entrance of Shaft 9, his lungs burned with stale air, and his legs ached from tension and exertion. He stepped out into the open night, breathing deeply as the starlight washed over him. It felt too quiet, too still, as though even the wind had paused to watch him. He looked out over the ridges in the direction of the abandoned settlement marked on Remy's map. Redhorn, a place he hadn't visited since the 70s, when it had been full of workers living out of old trailers and drinking cheap beer after long shifts. Most of the trailers had been cleared out when the mine was shut down, but some remained, rotting, forgotten, dust-choked shells that still bore the marks of a life cut short. Somewhere in that maze of rusted aluminum and peeling paint was Trailer 27. Somewhere inside that trailer, Remy had left the next step, the next piece of the truth Maddox had never wanted, but now had no choice but to follow. He tightened his grip on the metal box and started walking again, his shadow stretching long across the desert floor. The past was no longer a memory. It was an open door, and Maddox Crane, whether he liked it or not, had stepped back through. Dawn in the desert did not rise softly so much as it revealed itself in layers. First the paling of the sky, then the faint suggestion of distant hills returning from darkness, and finally the slow spread of gold across the land, bringing with it a sense that the night's dangers had merely shifted shape rather than disappeared. Maddox Crane felt every hour of sleeplessness as he pushed forward through the ragged terrain, the metal box tucked securely under his arm. The walk from the mine to the old settlement at Redhorn had stretched longer than he remembered, or perhaps it was simply that age made every slope taller and every mile wider. Still, something kept him moving, a mix of dread, curiosity, and an old loyalty he thought he had buried years ago. Redhorn appeared gradually over the crest of a shallow ridge, its cluster of derelict trailers scattered like rusted bones across a patch of wind-beaten earth. The place had once been home to dozens of miners, technicians, and transient workers, whose names were now nothing more than faded ink on forgotten documents. From a distance, the settlement looked like a graveyard for tin shells. Up close, it looked worse. Maddock descended toward the remains of the place, boots crushing brittle sagebrush underfoot. The air held a different scent here, not the dry purity of open desert, but something stale, tinged faintly with machine oil and the ghost of habitation. The settlement had gathered dust for decades, yet Maddock could sense an unsettling familiarity in the silence. He had spent weeks of his youth here during the Black Coyote Project's early days, eating powdered eggs in cramped kitchens, listening to cheap radios crackle in the night, and sleeping on thin mattresses that smelled of sweat and desert heat. Now those memories drifted around him like echoes, sharp enough to sting. The photograph in the box had shown him and Remy Boyle standing side by side in front of a chain-link fence. Remy had his arm around Maddock, grinning like a man who trusted the world more than the world deserved. Maddock had stared at that picture during the walk, unable to shake the feeling that something vital had been left unsaid or undone all those years ago. The key in his pocket, BC-27, had been the next link in a chain that had stretched half a lifetime. He had no choice now but to follow it through to the end. He approached the first trailer cautiously, not because he expected danger inside, but because it felt wrong to disturb a place frozen in time. The door hung loose on broken hinges, swaying slightly with the breeze. He looked inside, but saw nothing but a collapsed cot and walls peeling from heat. Maddock turned his gaze to the numbers stenciled faintly on each rusted shell. Most were too faded to read, but he found the pattern he remembered from decades earlier. The rows had been arranged in a crooked horseshoe around a communal fire pit, now filled with sand. Trailer 27, if the arrangement had not changed, would be near the back, slightly elevated on a patch of red earth that had given the place its name. He walked slowly, listening for any sound that didn't belong. His encounter in the mine had left his nerves taut. The two men searching for him were not likely to have given up. If they knew about the relay room, if they knew about the phone booth, then they surely knew about Red Horn as well. Maddock felt exposed in the open daylight, too easily seen, too easily tracked, but he had come too far to turn back. Trailer 27 stood at the far end of the settlement, its metal skin faded to a chalky pallor. The number was barely visible, but it was there, scratched along the side under a layer of dust. Unlike the others, its door was closed. Maddock hesitated, then placed his hand on the handle. It felt warm under his fingertips, warmed by the rising sun. He pushed it slowly, bracing himself for whatever waited inside. The trailer's interior was surprisingly intact. Dust coated every surface, but nothing appeared disturbed. A small counter lined one side, a fold-down table the other. The floor creaked as Maddock stepped inside. He inhaled the stale air, almost expecting the layers of time to peel back and reveal himself and Remy in their younger years, arguing over a radio that never picked up the right frequency. But the trailer remained silent. He set the metal box on the table and studied the room carefully. If Remy had left something for him, it wouldn't be obvious. Remy had been cautious, brilliant, paranoid, and good at hiding things in plain sight. Maddock checked under the mattress, behind the counter, inside old cabinets. Nothing. A flicker of frustration rose in him. Had the key been nothing more than a dead end? He sat heavily on the edge of the cot and closed his eyes. He let himself sink into the memories of Remy's gestures, habits, quirks. Remy had been a man of patterns, never trusting floors or walls, but always trusting the one place others ignored. Maddock stood slowly and stepped toward the center of the room. He knelt and ran his palm across the floorboards. The boards near the foot of the cot felt uneven, slightly raised. He pried one loose with his pocket knife. Beneath it lay a narrow wooden hatch, covered in dust. His heart hammered with a mixture of relief and dread. He lifted the hatch, revealing a small storage compartment beneath the floor. The scent that rose from the hidden chamber was unmistakable. Old paper, machinery, and something metallic. Inside, nestled between wooden beams, were stacks of cassette tapes bound with brittle elastic bands, a portable tape recorder, and several maps wrapped in oilcloth. Maddock lifted the topmost item and stared at it. A cassette, labeled simply with the initials RB. He swallowed hard. This was Remy's voice, or what was left of it. Hands trembling, Maddock placed the cassette into the recorder and clicked the play button. Static filled the trailer at first, a harsh whispering that made him wince. Then, through the static, a familiar voice emerged, older than Maddock remembered, rougher, weighed down by strain and urgency. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it, or I had to disappear. Doesn't matter which. Remy paused to clear his throat. They'll call it an accident. They always do. But you and I know better. Maddock leaned closer, gripping the recorder as if it might vanish. You were right to leave when you did, Remy continued. But I couldn't. Not after what we saw. Not after what they forced us to sign. Black Coyote wasn't a containment project. It was a cover-up. They used the accident to hide something else, something they buried in the shaft before sealing it. The static grew louder for a moment before receding. I tried to expose them. I gathered what I could, but I knew they were watching me. So I hid the tapes, hid the maps, well, you'll find the rest. Maddock felt his throat close. You were the only one I trusted, Maddock. You always were. If you're listening, it means they've opened the trail again. It means they're cleaning house. Finish what I started. Don't let them erase us. The recording clicked off. Maddock sat frozen, letting the weight of Remy's words sink deep into him. The guilt he'd carried for decades now twisted into something sharper. Remy had stayed to fight. Maddock had walked away. And now the past had circled back, demanding something he wasn't sure he still had to give. Before he could gather his thoughts, the silence shattered. A vehicle engine growled in the distance. Maddock snapped to attention and moved to the nearest window. Dust plumed along the dirt road leading into the settlement. A black SUV, the kind used by contractors and men who didn't want to be identified, rolled steadily toward the trailers. They had found him. Maddock grabbed the metal box and the handful of tapes he could manage. His body moved on instinct, faster than he would have thought possible for a man his age. He slipped the rest of the tapes into the floor compartment, closed it, and dropped the hatch into place. He stepped quietly toward the back of the trailer, searching for another exit, when a heavy knock shook the door behind him. Maddock Crane, we need a word. The voice was cold, professional. It wasn't a request. Maddock forced his breathing to steady. The trailer's back window had long been sealed shut. There was no way out except through the front. He looked at the recorder still clutched in his hand. He couldn't let them take it. He couldn't let Remy's work die here. Another knock, harder this time. Maddock, don't make this difficult. He slipped the recorder into his jacket and stared at the metal box. Too big to hide, too important to leave. His heart pounded as he made a decision. With a deep breath, he grabbed the box under his arm, and before the men could break the door, he kicked open the opposite side panel of the trailer. The rusted sheet of metal groaned, gave way, and fell outward with a dull crash. He climbed out, boots hitting the dirt hard, and sprinted toward the ravine behind the settlement. Shouts erupted behind him. The SUV door slammed. Footsteps thundered across gravel. Maddock stumbled, but kept moving, fueled by something deeper than fear, by obligation, by friendship, by a truth that demanded to be seen. Bullets cracked the air, hitting the ground dangerously close. Maddock ducked behind a boulder, clutching the box so tightly his knuckles burned. He could hear the men spreading out, circling him. The ravine offered little cover, but ahead he saw an abandoned drainage tunnel half buried by sand. If he could reach it, he might buy himself a few minutes enough to think, to breathe, to survive. He forced his aching legs to move. Each step felt like lifting stones, strapped to his ankles. But he reached the tunnel entrance, just as the men crested the ridge behind him. He slid inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The tunnel curved sharply, concealing him from view. He could hear the men arguing, footsteps scattering above. Maddock pressed on through the narrow passage until he reached a wider chamber, where collapsed beams formed a crude shelter. He set the metal box down and sank beside it, chest heaving. For several long minutes, he listened. The men searched the surface. They were close, but they hadn't found him yet. He looked down at the box again and opened it slowly. Remy's maps, the list of names, the photograph. Each piece was a shard of a story too big to fully grasp, and Maddock knew what he had to do. He had to send the truth out into the world. He had to activate whatever transmitter Remy had prepared. It was their last chance, his last chance. The settlement above rustled with movement, the men regrouping, planning their next sweep. Maddock closed the box and held it to his chest. Whatever happened now, he had made his choice. The desert had woken its ghosts, and he would not let them vanish again. He rose to his feet, gripped the box with both hands, and stepped deeper into the darkness, determined to finish what Remy had started, no matter what it cost him. If you want the next story, subscribe to the channel. Watch the next videos, there's more waiting for you. Share this video with someone who likes stories like this.